Hi, my name is Prince Solomon, and today I'm going to be talking about Frank III and Lorenzo Fertitta, also known as the Fertitta brothers, and Zuffa UFC. Some background is that Frank III and Lorenzo Fertitta are brothers, also known as the Fertitta brothers, from a prominent American business family. Their father, Frank Fertitta Jr., was a well-known businessman and the founder of Fertitta Enterprises, a holding company involved in various industries. The Fertitta family has deep ties to the gaming industry, and particular in Las Vegas. Before their involvement in UFC, the Fertitta brothers were deeply engaged in the operations and expansions of Station Casinos, a major casino and hotel chain in Nevada. For some education, a background of their education, Frank III attended USC, where he graduated with a BA/BS, and Lorenzo Fertitta attended the University of San Diego and continued on at NYU, where he got his MBA. After completing their studies, both brothers got their start in business at the Fertitta's Enterprises, the family-owned company. The Fertitta family had been involved in various businesses, but the brothers focused their efforts on the gaming industry, which was booming in Las Vegas during the 1990s. Their entry in the casino business came when they, along their partner Wilbur Bingham, acquired the station's casinos in 1993 from Frank Jr. Frank III and Lorenzo were instrumental in the growth of the station's casino, using their business acumen to expand the company significantly, especially by catering to a local market in Las Vegas, a strategy that set them apart from the larger and their competitors, where strips on the casinos on the strips were mostly tourist focused and not really local focused. Going into their discovery of MMA, the Fertitta's brothers' entry into mixed martial arts and their eventual purchase of UFC in 2001 was largely driven by their deep interest in the entertainment and sports industries, combined with a growing sense that MMA had untapped potential. Lorenzo explained in a blog that their father, Frank Jr., used to take them to championship boxing matches when they were younger. And this sparked a love for sports and the sports industry for both brothers, for both the Fertitta brothers. As for the acquisition of UFC, the brothers' entry into MMA began when they were introduced to Dana White, who had been friends with Lorenzo from their time growing up in Las Vegas. They went to high school together. While Dana White was closely connected to UFC, and after the Fertitta brothers expressed their interest in the UFC and MMA, he became their guide to the organization. The Fertitta brothers recognized the UFC's potential for growth and agreed to purchase UFC in January 2001 for 2 million dollars, a price that was significantly lower than what it would eventually be worth after the transformation of the brand. They brought in Dana White as president of UFC, who was instrumental in helping them shape the UFC into the global phenomenon it is today. The initial challenges that the Fertitta brothers went through when they bought the UFC was it had low credibility and a controversial image, and the sports faced significant hurdles, including limited regulation and scrutiny from government officials as well. The UFC was essentially a cash-burning operation, not producing enough income to sustain itself. Their acquisition of the UFC was seen by many as a risky investment. However, the Fertittas saw potential in the sport's global appeal, and believed they could turn it around. The Fertittas brothers had a clear strategic vision for the UFC. They were not just looking to own the brand, they wanted to transform it into a mainstream global sport. Here's how they made that happen. They wanted to improve the business side. The brothers and their partner Dana White started by cleaning up the UFC's image. They worked to ensure that there was more regulation in the sport and began to push standardization of rules, which made the fights more safer and more appealing to a broader audience. They also wanted to promote and expand the brand, focusing on promotion. They secured major television deals and worked to get the UFC on cable networks, which helped attract more viewers. They also wanted to create star fighters. They knew that recognizable fighters were important and they wanted to turn them into household names. The Fertitta brothers and Dana recognized the importance of building personalities within the sport, which would help promote UFC on a larger scale. And they also wanted to focus on expanding internationally. Going global, bringing events to new markets like Europe, Asia, and Latin America, which helps grow its fan base. And their international reach turned the UFC into a worldwide sensation. For their growth and expansion, they implemented a reality TV show, a key factor in UFC's mainstream success. The reality TV show is The Ultimate Fighter, which was released in 2005. The show served as a game changer to a much wider audience. The reality TV show featured up-and-coming fighters competing for a UFC contract, with each season following the intense personal and athletic struggles of the contestants. The show was broadcasted on Spike TV, and its debut season was a massive hit, drawing in millions of viewers. It helped transform the perception of UFC from a niche underground spectacle to a legitimate professional sport. Fans became invested in the fighters' journeys, and the drama and excitement of the show helped to build personalities within the sport. This in turn led to bigger draws for UFC fights, as fans were now not just watching people fight, they were following their stories of their favorite fighters. The Ultimate Fighter series helped introduce future stars like Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner, whose rivalries and performances on the show brought an incredible amount of attention to the UFC. The show became the cornerstone of UFC's television strategy and played a critical role in expanding its fan base beyond its loyal hardcore followers. They also focus on international expansion. As UFC gained traction in the United States, the brothers and Dana saw sight of global expansion, capitalizing on the sport's rising popularity worldwide. They began bringing UFC events to international markets in efforts to make it a truly global brand. One of the most important international markets for the UFC was Brazil, which has a rich history in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. UFC made its first appearance in Brazil in 1998, but it wasn't until the early 2000s that it really capitalized on the country's passion of the sport. Events in Brazil helped solidify the UFC's standing in South America, creating a loyal fan base. They also brought it to the shores of Canada, which was another key step in expanding globally. In 2008, the UFC held its first event in Montreal, and the success of UFC 83 card, which saw George St. Pierre defend his welterweight title, marked the UFC's growing appeal in North America. Canada became one of the UFC's most successful international markets, with packed arenas and growing number of Canadian fighters. Another market that they tapped into was the UK and Europe. The UFC expanded into Europe with successful events, starting with UFC 38 in 2002. Over the years, the UFC continued to grow its presence across Europe, with major events held in countries like Germany, Ireland, and Sweden. The rise of international fighters like Conor McGregor from Ireland brought a fresh wave of global attention, further boosting the UFC's popularity in Europe. UFC's success, coming from a struggling business to a billion-dollar empire, When the Fertitta brothers acquired UFC, like mentioned, they weren't doing so well. The company was in deep financial trouble, facing challenges like low revenue, low viewership, and a damaged reputation. However, their investments in marketing, regulations, and global expansion helped reshape the UFC into a legitimate sports enterprise. Over the years, the UFC evolved into a billion-dollar empire with UFC with massive revenue streams from pay-per-view events, merchandise, sponsorships, and media rights. The strategic moves that they did included securing major TV deals. The UFC partnerships included with Spike TV, where they launched their series, and later Fox Sports and ESPN, allowed the company to reach millions of viewers across the world. The inclusion of UFC advertisement and shows on major cable networks helped bring the sport to households that would otherwise never have tuned in. Another important strategic move was building the star power. The Fritas brothers, the Fertitas brothers, and Dana White recognized that, like any major sport, they need star fighters to drive fan engagement. By creating larger than life personas like George St. Pierre and Conor McGregor, the UFC turned its fighter into global superstars. These stars drew in both dedicated and casual viewers. Another move that they made was expanding their pay-per-view model. UFC's pay-per-view model became the cornerstone of sports business, bringing in millions per event. Iconic fights like McGregor vs. Nate Diaz and McGregor vs. Khabib generated record-breaking numbers, elevating the sports profile. And a real important move that I believe is establishing UFC as the number one MMA organization. Through careful management and acquisition, the UFC established itself as a premier MMA organization worldwide. This led to the consolidation of the sport, where the UFC became the top brand and the top placement of MMA, with professional MMA fighters looking for the highest level of competition and the largest purses aimed to compete for the MMA. In comparison, UFC is now the NFL of football. And I believe this is a great strategic move because when people think of professional MMA fighters, when people think of fighting, they think of UFC. They don't think of the other brands below them. And in conclusion, by focusing on specific areas, the Fertitas brothers were able to transform the UFC into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The Fertitas brothers later on sold the UFC to WME IMG for approximately $4 billion. That's approximately 2,000% return on their money from their initial investment. And that's it for my topic on the Fertitas brothers and Zuffa UFC. And these are my references. Thank you.